You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. It's Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com. There you go. Welcome to the big show, my family and friends. We certainly appreciate you guys coming by. As always, you guys are the Chris Voss Show family. The family that loves you but doesn't judge you. At least not as harshly as your mother-in-law. She never liked you anyway, folks. So we've got an amazing author on the show today. We're going to be talking to him about his newest, hottest book. He's a multi-book author. And one of the original author, he's the original author. I was going to say authors, but he's the author of The First 90 Days, Proven Strategies for Getting Up to Speed, Faster, Smarter, that came out, I believe, 2003 and updated in 2013. His newest book, The 6 Disciplines of Strategic Thinking, Leading Your Organization to the Future, comes out January 9th, 2024. Michael D. Watkins will be joining us on the show today. In the meantime, we beg, plead, all that sort of good to guilt and shame you into referring the show to your family, friends, and relatives. For 15 years, the CEOs, the billionaires, the White House presidential advisors, the governors, the Congress members, the Pulitzer, I covered Pulitzer Prize, U.S. ambassadors, astronauts, all the smartest people are on the Chris Voss Show. That's just it. We don't let dumb people on this show. I'm the only one who got on this show 15 years ago, but that's why I did it. It's because, you know, no one's going to let me on their show for that matter. Have you seen me lately? Anyway, guys, share the Chris Voss Show glow of the rich intelligence that is imparted to our show by these amazing authors. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss 1 on the tickety-talkety over there, and Chris Voss, facebook.com if you want to talk to me on the show and all that crazy stuff. So getting into it, the 6 disciplines of strategic thinking. Michael D. Watkins is an expert on leadership transitions and organizational transformation and author of the international bestseller, The First 90 Days. His newest book is a how-to guide for the modern leader. Here he represents the 6 disciplines of strategic thinking that separate the great from the good. Developed through his storied career, his approach to strategic thinking, the set of mental disciplines leaders use to recognize potential threats and opportunities, establish priorities, and mobilize themselves and their organizations to envision and enact promising paths forward is the model followed by some of today's most successful CEOs and new business leaders. Welcome to the show, Michael. How are you?
I am super well, Chris, and just really delighted to be able to spend some time with you and talk about what is my current favorite subject.
There you go, leadership. And we're delighted to have you as well. We love the topics of leadership. Give us your .coms, Michael, so people can follow you on the interwebs.
Sure. So genesisadvisors.com, advisors with an ERS, and amzn.to, which is the business school I teach at in Switzerland, where I'm a professor of leadership and organizational change.
There you go, Switzerland. We did a show, I think, yesterday from Switzerland, or I guess from Switzerland. So we're doing a lot of Switzerland stuff there. We're getting huge. We're huge in Switzerland. Now I just need a numbered deposit account. So
I didn't hear you say that, Chris.
They don't do that anymore, evidently, from what I understand, or maybe they do. So, Michael, you've written 14 books now. Is that correct?
Yes. And I my standing joke about this is I wrote one book that sold, I think it's 1.8 million copies at this point, Chris, and 13 that are, 25 copies each. So I hit a home run and a bunch of foul balls, basically. But
well, it's the follow-up. It's the journey, right? Yeah. But here's another 8 million right here in your newest book. So give us a 30,000 overview of what's inside the 6 disciplines of strategic thinking.
Sure. It was okay to start with sort of how I got doing this, right? Because I think it just give you a bit of context. So you mentioned the first 90 days. I wrote this book. It took off. I ended up building a consulting company. But my own personal practice is working with CEOs taking new roles, right? And that can be experienced CEO coming in from the outside. It can be someone who's first-time CEO moving inside. those are my favorites, the first-time CEOs, because it's just such a big leap in the job, right? To do that. And so I work with them on how to make successful transitions into new leadership roles. And that was the origin of the first 90 days. But of course, you work with these folks and you're kind of seeing the way they think, right? And you're observing the way they think. And you start to see some who are just kind of like, they seem to just kind of like home in on exactly the right things, focus on exactly the right issues, kind of see the future and know how to mobilize their organizations to get there. And you're kind of like, wow. And there are other folks where, they may be very good operating executives. And I have huge respect, Chris, for operating executives, right? But they're not really strategic thinkers. And I mean, I say these days that we're living in perhaps the most exciting and terrifying time in the history of humanity. If there's a need for strategic thinking, at a time greater than current, I'm not quite sure what that is.
Strategic thinking is one of the most important things, I think, in business and leadership. Strategy, when I was a kid, strategy was like my favorite game. I love the game Stratego. I was too dumb for chess, and I loved Risk. And I used to play Risk like obsessively.
Start with Australia and take over the world, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Once you could beachhead in Australia and lock that out so that no one could get in, you pretty much could eventually take, all the things. And so I would play these games incessantly because I don't know, that was what you did back in the day. We didn't have video games, but the strategy element of it was something I loved, the mapping, the forward thinking and stuff. And I didn't realize what game that was playing with my brain, to where when I started my first business at 18 and then went on from there, how important that strategic thinking would be and in my life as well, and how I mapped out my life. We'll get into this some more, but let's talk about you and let's hear your hero's journey. How did you grow up? How did you get into leadership and strategy and all the things?
Little tiny town in Northern Ontario, Canada, to electrical engineering in Southern Ontario, to a brief, somewhat unsuccessful career as an actual engineer, right? And then got super interested in business, went and started to do an MBA at a Canadian school, got even more interested in research and writing while I was there. And so I went to do a PhD at Harvard. And by the way, I'm sure at some point you've heard of the book, Random Walk on Wall Street, right? What I'm describing is a career that was a random walk around a whole bunch of places, right? I mean, I'd love to tell you that there was strategic thinking involved in my career, Chris, but no, absolutely none, right? More, I think, a series of pretty good decisions. And then after I finished, I taught at Harvard for 13 years. I taught at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, teaching mostly negotiation and diplomacy. And then I went to HBS, where I taught negotiation, corporate diplomacy, as I then called it. And then I just sort of, wrote this book on leadership transitions, and it kind of just took off and took over my life, basically. And I became Mr. Transition, so all that work I did before kind of got, set aside to a degree. So that's basically the story. And as I said, the more recent work on strategic thinking really flows out of all that coaching and consulting work I do with senior execs.
There you go. Strategic thinking is just everything. It really is. And how much of a difference, if you could put a percentage on it, we're just guesstimating, no one's going to hold you to this. What percentage of being successful as a leader do you think is being strategic? Probably in
at senior levels, we're talking about like at the CEO level or the C-suite level.
Yeah.
40%.
There you go. It's 40%. Everything. Whether you're being strategic about, I imagine, your employee strategy, your investor strategy, all the different variations of things you need to focus on.
Where I'd bump it up higher is when you start including one of the disciplines that I talk about in the book, which is political savvy. When you start to include political savvy and strategic thinking, now we're up to 65%, right? So I think it depends on how you package strategic thinking. What you include is pretty important.
Now, going through the book, the core structure of the book outlines 6 mental disciplines, as you mentioned, one of them that underpins strategic thinking. Can you tease a little bit of that out to us?
Sure. So, and before I do that really quickly, right? So, not a very good definition out there, I thought, when I started, of what strategic thinking is, right?
Mm-hmm.
You talk to people, especially HR people developing senior leaders, you say, is strategic thinking important? Yes, strategic thinking is important.
Mm-hmm.
What is strategic thinking? I know it when I see it. Right? I mean, that was basically what I was getting, Chris. It was like, I know it when I see it, right? I know when somebody, like, well, let's push on that a little bit, right? Let's try to build up a bit of a better model, because, I'm an educator, right? That's the core of what I do, is education. I love education. I love working with leaders, especially senior leaders and developing leaders. And that's just a huge passion for me. Mm-hmm. But you can't put together good programs to develop people if you don't know what the target is. What are you working on exactly, right? And I know it when I see it is not a good enough target for developing something like strategic thinking. And that was part of what got me going down this road, right? Mm-hmm. So 6 disciplines, real quickly, knock them out. Discipline number 1, pattern recognition, right? Great strategic thinkers are able to look out in the world in all its complexity and all its noise and say, that's what's important about what's going on. Mm-hmm. That's an emerging opportunity. That's a potential threat. That's what we need to be focusing our attention on.
Pattern recognition is so important. One of the things that I went through when I started my first company, I was going through massive anxiety, and I didn't understand what it was. It was part of my AD that I'd had all my life, and I was collecting stuff and counting. And so when I went in with the severe anxiety to the psychiatrist, he says, I told him that I counted stuff, and he was like, not Rain Man quality, but I count stuff. No. And he says, what are you doing? And I go, I do pattern recognition where I count stuff. I didn't know it was pattern recognition at the time, but it was part of my strategic upbringing and playing those games. And he goes, what are you doing now? And I go, I just count things like billboards. I count billboards. I look at companies and I go, how many billboards do they have? How much are they spending? How much do they probably make? What's their ROI based upon the thing? I would be trying to figure out how business models worked of companies through seeing their advertising and just counting stuff. Just like how many McDonald's are there in the Valley? What's their marketing game? What's their thing? And seeing those patterns really helped. The only problem is my psychiatrist said that if you didn't use this for business, we'd have you committed right now, because counting things for no reason is insane. But which I probably was a little bit at the time. But those pattern recognitions are everything. It helped me identify when Twitter came out and finally became a thing. It's helped me through so many of my things and other people's things, and recognizing what you mentioned, those emerging trends.
It's just absolutely central. And if you can't do that, none of the other stuff really matters a whole lot. And what you just said too really points out a key thing you do to build your pattern recognition of abilities, right? Which is immerse yourself in something, like deeply immerse yourself, right? There's this notion of the general purpose strategic thinker. I don't believe that, right? I think that you build strategic acumen and thinking ability around distinct domains, just the way you did, right? So that then when the number of billboards changed or something new showed up, you kind of went, you right away, you recognize it right away. You're onto, okay, what does that mean? Yeah. And that brings us to the second one, which is systems thinking, right? Thinking about things in system terms, building up mental models of how the world that you're interested in works, right? If A happens, then that's likely to generate B, which is pretty, likely to go to C, and it's going to set up a feedback loop that's going to lead to D. And beginning to see the world through those powerful but simple models of the way things work. We would call them mental models. I was trained originally, I mentioned, as an engineer, so systems analysis was kind of central to the education we got. And I don't do engineering, but the discipline, there's that word again, of thinking about things as systems, feedback loops, tipping points, right? You go to this point and it's all fine, and then whoop, because heads off into the stratosphere. So that's the second one. Does that make sense, Chris, to you?
It does, because you have to be able to have that to be able to activate it.
100%. Now, there's one real important thing here, right? Which is, as valuable as those models are, you got to be super careful that the world doesn't change in ways that your models don't track, right? You've got this frozen model in your head, and all of a sudden AI hypothetically shows up, and it's all. And so the process of unlearning, revising, staying current with what's going on is just so important, right? In this sort of thinking, right? Mental models shouldn't be static.
Yeah,
Right?
and you
dynamic.
And I think the important thing is you mentioned, recognizing that, as you said, mental models shouldn't be static. I see a lot of entrepreneurs that will hold on to a model that sometimes is working, sometimes is not, and they'll drive it in the ground and not recognize when change is upon them. We've seen companies like Kodak, and there's a million business stories about people. Even IBM's like, why would anyone want a personal computer in their house? And so models change, especially now the way we're changing with AI.
They really do. Well, we started out just talking about how just incredibly dynamic the world is right now. I mean, my goodness, right?
It's hard to even do the pattern recognition when it's moving on.
Yeah, but it's super important still to try, right? To try and figure out what in the midst of all this noise is important that I need to pay attention to, right?
Yeah.
And just back to your point, I mean, when you started out with Twitter, right, you saw something emerging, and you said, okay, that's something we're gonna. It's going someplace, right? It's got energy, it's got momentum. We're gonna ride that horse, basically, right, to interesting places, and that's part of what this is all about. Yeah. So that's discipline number 2. Discipline number 3, I call it mental agility. It's a little bit of a combination of things. I thought about writing chapters on separate pieces, but in the end, I decided to combine them. The 2 things are, I call it level shifting or cloud to ground thinking, right? How do you go from the big picture, right, 30,000 foot level view of things, down to the ground, to the detail, but not get stuck up in the clouds and not get stuck down on the ground, know when and how to move between those levels of thinking, right? And be able to do it with intentionality, right? To not just kind of like, oh, where am I? I'm up in the clouds today. Imagine that, right? Or gosh, I'm stuck in the ground, So the leaders I work with, that really are the best strategic thinkers, they have that capacity, right? They can move between those levels. They do it with intention, and it's hugely powerful, right? Because they can establish the big picture, but the people working for them know they better be on top of the detail, right? Because if I'm unsure about the detail, I'm going to dig into that until I'm happy.
Yeah. Intentionality is everything.
Sorry, say that again.
Intentionality is everything.
Absolutely, I think, right? And what we decide to pay attention to, and how we're intentional about what we do,
or figuring out what you need to pay attention to too, right?
100%.
100%.
So the other one that I packaged in with this around mental agility is, you mentioned you didn't like chess as a kid, but it's really that ability to think forward a couple moves, and then
there you go.
Come back and say, which direction should I go? And I mean, Stratego, which I also played, I'll have to admit, right? In addition to Risk, and hitting those bombs, they always really hurt, right? I mean, it was always like, So anyway, there it is, right? But that ability just to kind of look forward and reason backward and say, okay, I make this move, my competitor's likely to do this, my best response is that, or what moves might they make, and what would my best responses be to that? Yeah. And it's just a little bit of action, reaction, move, counter move, look out a couple of moves, because you can't look farther, right? You can't map this out to, the ultimate detail. The best you can typically do in business is set good direction, get the good direction going, make good initial moves, and see where it takes you, and then start to adapt. Yeah.
That's what I used to do with the bombs. I used to create different traps. I was really good at trapping and Stratego. And, when you kind of know lanes, I think it is, if I recall rightly, on lanes. It's been a long time since I played, but you bring some of it back. But I used to create little bomb traps. So they trip one bomb and they'd be like, oh, he's probably got something there. And then they come find all the other bombs.
Well, someday you and I should have a Stratego match for.
Yeah, we should. It would be fun to play that game just again for shits. It's been so long, but I used to beat the pants off my brother. He used to get so angry. The next one up was structured problem solving.
Yeah, so this one is really about framing and solving the problems you and your leadership team are going to focus on. Right. I've got a colleague at IMD, Julia Binder, and she and I have written an article for the Harvard Business Review that's coming out in the January-February magazine issue about framing problems. And the tagline for it is not jumping to solutions, right? not taking the time to figure out what's the real problem here, right? And how do we then work with that real problem and not just kind of focus in and say, what's that? Let's go, let's start generating solutions. There's more, machinery behind how to do that in large organizations and big teams. But the basic idea is I think, pretty intuitive, right? It's just so easy to say this problem's like that problem, and that's the solution, so let's go there, right? And not step back and ask and inquire and have curiosity about what's the real problem we're trying to solve here.
Yeah, or what's the real problem in and of itself? I used to call it looking the dragon in the mouth and trying to flush out all the potential variations. Are we doing the right thing? Is this the right thing to do? Instead of just going, whoa, we're going over there. How do we do it? What's the downfalls of this? What's the upside? What's the downside? All those sort of strategic thinking elements, maybe a little bit of overkill, but if we could live with looking the dragon in the mouth and we could deal with the downsides, or we could mitigate the downsides, then
I don't think that's overkill at all. I think that's good leadership, right?
Thanks.
Because that's back to the whole piece about not assuming that the world is staying static and making sure you're tracking with what the real problem is. And there's nothing worse than solving a problem by putting a Band-Aid solution on it, not knowing, but unsurprisingly watching it reemerge in some different form, right? And this is intended to kind of help you avoid that.
Yeah, it's really important to do all that because sometimes you're just you're trying to hijack maybe something that's popular. Like everyone's like, we should do AI now because everyone's doing that. And it's like, we don't know how to do AI. We're in a bricklaying business. What the fuck? I mean, I'm sure there's probably some future way AI is gonna play into that, but maybe in marketing. But it's one of those things where you just don't want to chase trends just because there's a trend. Any fallacy in that you see? I imagine you want to.
Oh, absolutely. No, there's no question, right? I mean, again, it goes back to that knowing what's important, right? Back to those trends you spotted with social media when you were launching, right? I mean, there's probably 100 things you could have focused on, but you focused on a few, right? Because you saw the possibilities.
Yeah, we definitely did.
Fifth discipline. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Go ahead.
All right, good. So fifth discipline I call visioning. That's one that I think is pretty obvious for most folks, right? That's a
visioning.
Part of strategic thinking. Yeah, and but there's a little more to it than just dreaming. It's important, but it has to be realistic dreaming to a degree. So how do you do that? You have to work your way back from the vision you create to, okay, how are we going to get there, right? How are we going to create a plan that's going to get us to that future? You need to bring people along with you as you vision, right? And I think that I coined a term in the book, powerful simplification, right? How do you make the vision simple but powerful so that people understand it, right? And they can tap into the energy that flows from seeing what could happen with the organization.
Yeah.
And of course, if it's too complicated, it may be a great vision. You may have a wonderful dream about where to go, but if your people don't understand and buy into it, it's not very valuable in the end.
That's true. I think maybe that's where a lot of companies fail is they maybe have a great vision. A new CEO comes in, he goes, "We're going over there," it was the big ship captain, and people are just like, "Why? And why should we care?"
Yeah.
What's in it for us?
What's in it with me? Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
Which actually, what's in it for me brings us to the final one, the sixth of the disciplines, which is the political savvy piece. And that's the one that I think people kind of go, okay, Michael, explain to me why political savvy is part of strategic thinking. And there's two pieces to it, I think, right? One is political savvy requires you to be strategic in how you try to influence people, right? You just don't go out and say, pick someone off the street or out of your organization, convince them about your vision, right? You decide who you're going to convince and how you're going to convince them, and you think it through, right? So there's that piece of it, but there's also the reality that making your strategy a reality requires that you build alliances. It requires that you influence people, right? And so if you can't do that, well, maybe the rest of it isn't all that helpful in the end.
Maybe it's helpful. And, if you're in a very large company, strategic alliances are important. We recently saw that big fallout with Sam Altman at OpenAI and kerfuffle about all of that. He's out Microsoft, but now Microsoft is the largest investor in OpenAI, which is kind of weird. They may be buying him next week. But, alliances with the board, alliances with your employees, alliances with your vendors, all these strategic alliances that help you get stuff done. Because, as a CEO, you're not a master of one vein. You have to sell to everybody. You got to sell your vision to everybody, everybody from vendors to employees to investors, board members, people working on your team have got to be on board. It's a full scale press, really.
Super is, right?
Yeah.
When I used to teach MBAs, some of them would think, well, when you get to the top of the organization, you're the CEO, you get to make all the calls, you got the power, you can make the decisions, and everything will be wonderful, right? And I'm kind of like, no, actually, as you get to the top, things only get more complicated politically, right? You've got to balance all those stakeholders. You've got to work the alignments. You've got to create the alliances, and that's externally, right, to shape what's going on outside. It's internally, and it's just, and that's in the end exactly, Chris, why I included it in the book.
Definitely, you got to do all the things when it comes down to it. So 6 different strategies: pattern recognition, systems analysis, mental agility, structured problem solving, visioning, and political savvy. So one of the conclusions you have in the book is developing your strategic thinking ability. What are some things that we can do to get in that strategy mindset?
Well, so this is super important, right? Because you could well say this is all fine. It's great, lovely model, like the disciplines, all very interesting. But can I realistically develop this capability, right? It's not terribly helpful if you tell me all the things I can never be, right? Because by virtue of, birth and upbringing, I'm either one of these or I'm not, right? And it was, by the way, it's the same conversation we had when I was teaching negotiation, right? Because again, you have people absolutely who are naturally better negotiators than others, but we always found we could make people better, right? Now you can debate 10% better, 20% better, maybe it's somewhere in that range. But that means a lot. If I can make you a 20% better negotiator, a 20% better strategic thinker than you are today, that has real value for you, for your organization, right?
Especially if I'm already good at it, right? So then we're just adding on.
Exactly. But even if you're not super good at it, right? Sometimes that's even more important that we make you at least average at doing it, right? Because otherwise you're
so if you suck, I'll make average length.
Well, we won't push too hard on that one if it's okay, right?
No, but that's actually good though.
Yeah, but the idea that this is something that can be learned, this is a set of skills that can be learned. That's a foundational idea because otherwise it's not much point in trying to do stuff, right? But if you believe that, which I do deeply, and if you believe that these disciplines are important ways of thinking, then you can begin to construct, I think of it as like an exercise program, right? Your strategic thinking exercise program, the mental work you do on a regular basis to start to build up these mental muscles of yours, pattern recognition, right? Just starting to read lots of newspapers and see, what do I think is important here, right? Or diving deep the way you did into, all those billboards and what decisions are those people making, right? So you can begin to accelerate the process. You can find somebody who's a super good strategic thinker and work with them and learn from them about how they think about the world and how they see the world. For visioning, you can start to do, it's a simple exercise I talk about in the book, right? Where you go into a room you haven't been in before, and rather than just, nice room, you go, well, okay, if I were going to change this room to make it a better room, a more enjoyable room perhaps to be in, or a more functional room to be in, what changes would I make? That helps work the little visioning muscle a little bit, right? Because there's an imagination component to doing that. So for each of the disciplines, I try to lay out some basic things you can do to start to work on it. And as I said, it's sort of the analogy is to physical fitness, only it's mental fitness, right? It's mental muscles you're building up. And having that idea of, you need to have an exercise program, right? That you pursue on reasonably disciplined, reasonably regular kind of basis.
And I think the importance of having that last item you talked about, where you look at things and how to improve them, kind of keep you from, well, we just need to copy what everyone else is doing and go do it. You've got to have, Tom Peters talked about it, creative swiping, but you've got to be able to take, maybe what's going on in the marketplace, whatever's hot, like AI, and you got to, okay, how can we build something that's unique? How can we build something that, isn't what everybody else is doing, that's chasing the everything else that everybody's doing model, I suppose. And
absolutely.
And so sitting in that and going, how do we make this different? That's the beauty of entrepreneurs that I love so much, especially young, small up and coming entrepreneurs that, they take a widget and they do some sort of innovation or improvement on it. They're like, this thing sucks, I can make this better. We had an author on yesterday where she used to read a lot of romance novels and rom-com novels, sort of things. And she's like, yeah, I would have done this better. And after several years of reading these books, she's like, I know I can do a better book. So she did one and it killed. So then we interviewed her for a second one. But yeah, this is the thing I love about entrepreneurs.
But that's such a super, super good example, right? Of her, she immersed herself in a domain until she saw the patterns and how it worked, and she built up a model in her brain about, this is how a romance novel gets constructed, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then she knocked it into the park. I mean, it's a wonderful example, Chris.
That definitely, and I think that's maybe where a lot of people don't. Do you think that maybe that's where a lot of leaders fail? They don't do that immersion. They just maybe try and hijack onto something that seems faddish.
Skipping over the surface of things, right? Which is never going to give you the insight that you need to have.
Yeah. Or they even want to do that.
No, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess there's one more piece, which it's in the book, but it's in more detail in an article that a colleague and I just wrote for Harvard Business Review, which is, how do you talk like a strategic thinker? How do you help people see that you're a strategic thinker, right?
Oh.
And it's a bit of a chicken and egg, because you don't get the opportunities to demonstrate you're a strategic thinker unless people think you're a strategic thinker, right? And so, but there's some pretty simple things you can do, and the way you engage in dialogue, the way the terms you use, that can signal that you're a strategic thinker, and that alone can open up opportunity for you.
There you go. And it can open opportunity for, people who see you as a leader. If they see you think strategically, if you're smart, if you're wise, if you're not impulsive and doing stupid stuff, I think makes a difference. I think people see that in you as a leader. Do they not? I don't know. I mean, I just
they absolutely
be
do.
Narcissistic.
They absolutely do. Boy, that's a topic we could spend a long time on. It's
narcissism or strategic narcissism.
Both, right? And what we know that tech CEOs tend to have certain kinds of personalities. Is that the personalities who want to be making decisions about potential weapons of mass destruction, right?
Oh boy. Yeah.
I don't think so, right? I don't think so. I mean, because what you mentioned, impulsivity, risk-taking ability, like seriously, plus huge financial incentives. Oh my, right?
Yeah. What could go wrong?
Exactly. What indeed.
So anything more we want to tease on in your book before we go?
So I think we've covered the foundations, Chris. I think the basic idea here is to try and, pull it apart, get pretty precise about what it is, identify those key disciplines, right? And have those make sense to people, and have them see that they're things they can work on, and give them some tools to work on them with, right? That's the fundamentals of what I was trying to do with the book.
There you go. So give us your final pitch out to people to order up your book, and .coms where people can onboard with you. I imagine maybe you have some coaching you do, or one-on-one stuff maybe, or consulting.
I do. I coach C-level executives, mostly taking new roles, but their strategic thinking is super important, right? Because you're usually establishing a new strategy for your organization. Look, has the world ever been more complex, more uncertain, more volatile, more ambiguous than what we're facing now? I can't think of a time when it was, right? I don't know how we got so lucky to be alive at this particular time in humanity, right? It's fascinating, terrifying, but it's also a time when it's never been more important to be able to engage in strategic thinking. It's what's going to in part take us through all this, or take your business through all this. And I guess that's message one. And message two is, no matter how good or not good you think you are at strategic thinking, you can get better. And this book can help you get better.
You can always get better. That's always true. It's a never ending, get better is like a never ending journey, isn't it?
It really is.
So there you go. Well, it's been wonderful, Michael, to have you on the show. Thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us.
I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to our Stratego grudge match.
Let's do that. I got to go learn to play the game again. I remember vaguely about it, but yeah.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it. Thanks, Manas, for tuning in. Order up the book wherever fine books are sold, because that's important to support our authors that come on the show. The 6 Disciplines of Strategic Thinking, Leading Your Organization into the Future, comes out January 9th, 2024. Michael D. Watkins. And check out all 14 of his other books and the original popular one, The First 90 Days, Proven Strategies for Getting Up to Speed, Faster, Smarter, Updated, and Expanded. And remember, we're almost to Christmas. So, well, like I said, it's not going to matter. We're releasing this in January. So order it for next Christmas. There you go. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, YouTube.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss, one on the TikTokity, and Chris.com. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you guys next time.